When we speak of grace, we often imagine comfort, the tender hand of God lifting us from despair, the gentle voice that whispers peace into our storms. And indeed, that is grace. But there is another face to grace, one that does not soothe immediately but rather unsettles, one that wounds before it heals. This is the grace that hurts, the paradox of divine love that must sometimes break before it builds. When God's love truly enters a human heart, it does not come as mere affirmation of what we already are. It comes as transformation, and transformation is always disruptive. Think of the human heart as a field overgrown with weeds. For the good seed to take root, the ground must first be torn open. Grace, in its deepest form, is not a gentle breeze, but a plowshare cutting deep furrows through the soil of our self-dependence. And though the process is painful, it is also profoundly merciful, because it clears the ground for something new and alive to grow. Jonathan Edwards once wrote that the truest evidence of divine grace is not found in fleeting emotion or religious enthusiasm, but in a changed nature, a soul turned from self toward God. Yet such turning rarely happens without struggle. The human ego resists surrender with every fiber of its being. We cling to control, to comfort, to our illusions of righteousness. And when God's love confronts these illusions, it feels like a wound. The light that exposes the darkness in us burns before it blesses. The voice that calls us to repentance sounds at first like condemnation, until we realize it is the call of a physician revealing the disease that must be healed. There is something profoundly psychological about this process. When we face loss, failure, or moral conviction, our first instinct is to interpret it as rejection, to assume that pain is proof of divine displeasure. But often, what we are feeling is not the absence of grace but its intensity. We are being loved too deeply to be left unchanged. God's grace does not simply console, it confronts. It does not merely comfort the sinner, it transforms the soul. And transformation requires friction, the friction between what we are and what we are meant to become. Consider the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel. That strange midnight encounter is a perfect picture of this hurting grace. Jacob is blessed only after he is wounded. His hip is struck, his strength broken, but through that wound he receives a new name, a new identity. The limp he carries afterward is not a mark of shame, but a reminder that divine love met him in his struggle and remade him. We, too, walk with limps of our own, the visible and invisible reminders of the moments when grace met us in conflict, broke something within us, and left us forever changed. From a philosophical standpoint, this truth overturns the shallow optimism of modern spirituality, which seeks comfort without conviction, peace without purification. Real love cannot affirm everything in us, because not everything in us is lovable. There are parts of our hearts, pride, selfishness, bitterness, that must die for love to reign. And so God's grace becomes surgical, precise, intentional, and at times excruciating. Like a skilled surgeon, he cuts not to harm, but to heal. He allows the pain that saves us from a deeper destruction. The psychology of grace, then, is inseparable from the psychology of growth. In human relationships, too, we know that love sometimes demands confrontation. A parent disciplines a child, a friend speaks a hard truth, a mentor challenges a student, not to wound, but to strengthen. The same principle magnified applies to divine love. The pain is purposeful. It is love's necessary violence against all that keeps us from joy. It is in these moments of divine confrontation that our faith matures. When everything comfortable is stripped away, we discover whether we loved God for His gifts or for Himself. Pain exposes the motives of the heart. it compels us to look beyond circumstantial happiness toward enduring holiness. It transforms our faith from something decorative into something durable. And once we have endured the grace that hurts, we find that our understanding of God's goodness deepens, not as sentiment, but as substance. If you are walking through that kind of grace, the grace that burns, the grace that bruises, do not mistake it for abandonment. It may be the most intimate form of love you have ever known, for God's love is not passive. It pursues, corrects, reshapes, and refines. The very pain you wish away may be the hand of God clearing away the rubble so that new life can emerge. The grace that hurts is not the absence of God's favor, but its proof. It is love unwilling to let us remain in our lesser selves. And when we finally see the wounds for what they are, instruments of healing rather than harm, we begin to understand that grace is not always sweet, but it is always good. So when divine love feels like it is breaking you, remember, it is only breaking what was never meant to stay. And that, perhaps, is the most loving act of all, the wound that saves. If the grace that hurts is God's way of breaking us open, then what follows is His way of remaking us, the slow, refining fire of spiritual growth. This fire, though often feared, is the very place where grace deepens into strength. It is here that faith ceases to be an idea and becomes an experience, where God's love reveals its endurance not through comfort, but through correction. We tend to think of suffering as an interruption in the story of grace, as if pain were somehow outside of God's redemptive plan. But the opposite is true. The furnace is part of the formation. The heat that burns away the dross also reveals the gold. What trials do to metal, divine grace does to the soul, purifying, strengthening, and rendering it capable of holding the weight of glory. Jonathan Edwards often wrote of the believer's sanctification as a gradual transformation of the heart's affections, the reordering of our loves until they align with the love of God. But this reordering is not achieved through ease. The human heart is not gently persuaded away from its idols. It must be pried loose. The process feels like loss because, in a very real sense, something is being lost, the false self, the self that seeks satisfaction apart from God. Grace, therefore, refines us through pressure. It introduces friction between our desires and God's design so that, through the struggle, we might be drawn closer to the truth. There is a psychological realism in this. Growth always feels like contradiction at first. The old must die before the new can live. Every deep change, whether moral, emotional, or spiritual, carries a moment of disorientation, that in-between space where the familiar no longer fits, and the new has not yet formed. We call it suffering, but in God's hands it is transformation. The pain of refinement is not chaos. It is the disciplined artistry of divine wisdom. This is why the metaphor of fire is so striking. Fire both destroys and purifies. It consumes what cannot endure, yet it leaves behind what is essential. The same flame that terrifies also illuminates. When we are in the midst of it, all we can see is the burning, the things we loved being taken away, the certainties we relied on melting into uncertainty. But in hindsight, we see that the fire was not against us. It was for us. It was not random suffering, but the necessary process by which the soul becomes mature enough to bear the light of truth. Philosophically, this challenges our modern obsession with comfort as the measure of goodness. We often equate happiness with ease and struggle with failure. Yet the greatest minds, both sacred and secular, have understood that wisdom grows from difficulty. There can be no courage without fear, no patience without delay, no compassion without having known pain. To be refined by grace is to be drawn into the paradox of divine pedagogy, a teaching that uses adversity as its textbook. Think of how a tree strengthens its roots in the wind, or how muscles grow only through resistance. Spiritual resilience follows the same pattern. Without the wind, the roots remain shallow. Without resistance, the muscle remains weak. God's refining grace subjects us to both, not to crush us, but to deepen our capacity for endurance and love. Every challenge, every disappointment, every unanswered prayer becomes a tool in His hand, shaping the soul into something sturdier, humbler, and more luminous. And yet, in the moment of trial, the temptation is always to flee, to pray not for refinement, but for relief. We want the outcome of maturity without the process that produces it. But to reject the process is to remain spiritually fragile, untested, and unready. It is only through endurance that our faith becomes real. The grace that refines is not about removing the flame, but about remaining faithful within it, trusting that even the fire obeys God's design. Psychologically, this endurance reshapes us at a deep level. It teaches emotional intelligence, the capacity to stay steady when life trembles. It nurtures humility, the recognition that we are not self-sufficient, and it instills gratitude, the realization that even pain can be purposeful. Over time, the believer learns to interpret hardship not as divine hostility, but as divine intimacy. For God refines those He claims. The trial is not evidence of distance, but of belonging. When you begin to see your suffering through this lens, despair gives way to dignity. You may not understand the reason for the fire, but you begin to trust the refiner. You begin to see that every sorrow carries within it a seed of sanctification. The tears you shed are not wasted, they are part of the cleansing. The weakness you feel is not failure. It is the space where divine strength takes root. And perhaps that is the quiet miracle of refining grace. It transforms what once seemed unbearable into something sacred. The very struggle that once made you question God becomes the place where you experience Him most intimately. The pain that seemed senseless becomes the testimony that anchors someone else's hope. What fire intended for destruction, grace reclaims for purification. So when the flames rise and your heart trembles, remember this: you are not being burned away. You are being forged. The heat you feel is not the loss of grace, but its deepest expression. And when the refining fire has done its work, you will not be what you were, you will be what you were meant to be. If the breaking grace humbles us, and the refining grace transforms us, then the final movement of this divine process is the healing grace that restores us, not as we were, but as we were meant to be. This is the grace that turns wounds into witnesses, scars into signs of divine craftsmanship. It is not the denial of pain, but its redemption. What once disfigured now becomes the mark of renewal. There is something profoundly paradoxical about divine healing. God rarely erases the evidence of suffering. Instead, He consecrates it. The resurrected Christ still bore His scars. The marks in His hands and side were not defects to be hidden, but proofs of love to be revealed. In that same mystery, our healed wounds become sacred reminders. The visible testimony that grace not only meets us in pain, but transforms pain into participation in God's redemptive work. We often think of healing as a return to how things were before the hurt. But in truth, grace never takes us backward. It moves us forward into a deeper, wiser wholeness. The person who has walked through divine wounding and refining cannot return to the naivete of spiritual comfort. Something new has been born, a deeper awareness, a quieter strength, a tenderness that only the broken understand. The healed soul becomes capable of compassion in ways the unbroken never could. It learns to look upon others not with judgment, but with recognition. Psychologically, this is the point where suffering completes its transformation. Pain, when endured with grace, moves from the emotional to the existential. It shapes identity. What once felt like chaos begins to form coherence. The mind reframes what the heart endured. The suffering that once seemed meaningless becomes, in hindsight, the very narrative through which meaning was restored. This process mirrors what modern psychology calls post-traumatic growth. Yet the spiritual dimension runs deeper, for in divine healing, we do not merely recover from pain, we are remade through it. Philosophically, the beauty of this transformation lies in its moral logic. Evil and suffering are not annihilated, they are outwitted. God does not simply cancel the effects of pain, He repurposes them. What once seemed to oppose grace becomes the vehicle through which grace is displayed. Our wounds, when offered to God, become instruments of truth. They expose the limits of human self-reliance and reveal the reality of divine sufficiency. The soul that has been healed no longer speaks from theory, but from testimony, and testimony has a power that doctrine alone never will. This is why the healed become healers. The one who has been comforted becomes capable of comforting others. The one who has been lifted from despair knows how to lift the fallen. It is through our healed places that grace flows outward. And in this way, God multiplies the purpose of our pain. What once isolated us now connects us. What once silenced us now gives us a voice. The wound becomes a bridge, a sacred link between divine compassion and human need. Yet healing is not merely emotional restoration. It is spiritual integration. It means that the broken and the whole coexist within us without contradiction. To be healed by grace is not to forget the wound, but to live with it redeemed. The scar remains, but its meaning has changed. It no longer speaks of defeat, but of deliverance. It is no longer a record of what was lost, but a witness of what was found. This understanding demands humility because it recognizes that we do not heal ourselves. Just as no branch can graft itself back into the tree, no soul can restore itself apart from grace. Healing requires surrender, the letting go of our narrative, so that God may write His. We often resist this, preferring control over dependence. But divine healing begins at the point where self-sufficiency fails. Only then can grace enter freely, filling the fractures with something greater than what was there before. And in this final stage of divine grace, something profound occurs. Joy returns, but it is not the shallow joy of comfort regained. It is the deep, resonant joy that comes from having seen the goodness of God in the land of affliction. It is the joy that knows pain did not have the final word. This is not naive optimism, had turned the air poisonous. The recognition that what was dead can live again, not as imitation, but as renewal. The healed soul carries a quiet authority. It does not need to convince anyone of God's reality. It simply embodies it. People recognize something authentic, a peace that has been tested, a faith that has walked through fire and found it was not consumed. Such a person becomes a living testimony that the grace which wounds and refines also restores. If grace breaks us to awaken us and refines us to strengthen us, it heals us to send us back into the world as instruments of mercy, agents of hope, bearers of divine compassion. Our scars become our credentials. They speak the truth of grace more convincingly than any sermon ever could. So, if you find yourself today standing on the other side of pain, do not hide your scars. Let them tell the story. Let them become light for those still walking through the valley you once knew. The God who healed you intends to heal others through you, because in the end, every scar that grace redeems becomes a signature of love, proof that even what was broken can still shine.